Oh, it seems like a long time since I've been up here, although it has been a long time since I was giving lectures on the American landscape, which I did for 3 series. And this, I believe, will be the very last series I have on the American landscape. It's going to, let's hope, but and it's going to be primarily 20th century landscapes. But I thought I would do something that is not my usual pattern, and that is to give you one image per artist who's going to come up so that you know what is coming through this series. Is it working? If I'm by it. Okay. Now you can hear me better? Okay. So this is the artist we will be dealing with primarily today, I hope, Marsden Hartsley. But then George O'Keeffe, Charles Birchfield, who's a Midwesterner, Edward Hopper. Some of these artists are not artists who deal exclusively with landscape, but they have a significant attraction to landscape, and they do many paintings. And photography, this you would not expect, I believe. This is Dorothea Lange. It's called Tractored Out. Well, it's about the desolation in the 20s and 30s in the Midwest. Ansel Adams. Richard Diebenkorn. I think probably also you're not familiar with him. That's called Ocean Park series. He did primarily abstractions of landscape that we'll be looking at. And then from the 1970s, something called the New Topographics. Photographers are showing the world the way it is now, not the beautiful world we would like it to be. So that's the variety. So that's what's to come. Now, this is what was in the previous series, because I want to have sort of solidified for you the abrupt difference 20th century paintings and outlook toward landscape, how very different that is from the 19th century. So this is the quick review of the 19th century, where or when it was just by Americans and Europeans generally acknowledged that landscape painting was America's greatest form of painting. And it's what distinguished American art, not portraiture, not biblical scenes, not historical scenes, but the landscape, because our country, one of the most distinguishing things about it was its landscape, with a vast tracts of unexplored wilderness. As you know, there was never a sense that this was an inhabited land before. They just tended to think that the Native Americans were a vanishing tribe. But this is by Thomas Cole, who is thought to be the founder of the American Landscape School. This is done in the 1820s, and it's Catterskill Falls, that he began to popularize going out into the wilderness, going up and down the Hudson River, which is why Europeans, when they came, they might do that too. And then going out actually with your easel and your brushes and your paints and sitting outside and painting what you saw, which was not done before. I mean, the Impressionists do it, but that's another half a century to come. So it was just to show what made this country so alluring. It's a very religious point of view. This was a new Eden This was a new world. There was nothing like this in Europe, no uninhabited expanse like this. So it was as if civilization is starting over again in this country. That is Catskill Falls. Oh, and there is one Indian up there at the cave. Now you see how, even here, you see how landscapes carry messages that aren't like banner headlines, but this is not only how small humanity is, but how few humans are, and there's only one Native American. And then the far more famous painting by him that's in the massive painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum is just called by its nickname, the Oxbow, seen from in Northampton, Massachusetts. And there is in here also a message. And something I only thought out of nowhere at some point. Why is it? You tell me if you think this too. Generally, when you're looking at a landscape, you think you're looking from east to west. I figured out, I think it's because we look at wall maps and they're always arranged that you're looking at the East Coast on the right-hand side and the West Coast on the left. And I think we just transfer that into, this could be north-south, but no, we tend to just think it's east-west. So anyway, as if this were the east, the light is coming, the storm is being driven away, one area has been civilized, and here's the wilderness, the tangled wilderness yet to go. And since God and the sun are so generally equated, God is shining on this new country. The storms part for us as we move. And there he is down below, way down, just a little bit to right of the center, almost at the bottom border, as he's painting the scene. So we're invited to see him in. So this is I, the artist, am the vehicle by which you get to see this. Now, I don't know if any of you saw this in the good old days, if you were a true researcher. This was outside the main reading room at the New York 42nd Street branch of the library that's been sold, and now it's at the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. But this is Asher Durand, who was a friend and pupil of Cole, and it's called Kindred Spirits. And what you see here in the detail is the painter, Asher Durand, sort of pointing out with his painting stick, it's called a maul stick, features of the landscape, and he's pointing it out to William Cullen Bryant, a great nature poet. So here there's a claim also, isn't there, that I, the painter, point out to you what you perhaps yourself would not be seeing. I make this available to you. Then toward the middle of the century, Frederick Church, Niagara Falls. For this, I am going to read something from a contemporary at that time. What did he say? You have to go to Washington, to the National Gallery, to see this one. This is this painting is a testament to the national spirit, defined by the broad continent we call our own, by the onward march of civilization, by the conquering of savage areas. It's manifest destiny. And again, this is suffused with Christian symbolism, or was interpreted as being, because of course, there's again been a storm. You see the clouds there. And then there's a parting, and then you have the rainbow. Now the rainbow is, of course, from the mist coming up from that. But there is the biblical account where God promises Noah that he will never again destroy humanity, and he is putting a rainbow in the sky to remind himself of that. So it's a presence of God over this country. And when this was done, the glorifying that was done in this other, it is a magnificent painting. And you're standing in the water almost here. You can hear the rush and you're practically going to go over with it. But there were a lot of factories along the shore, and they've been eliminated to again get across this message. So it's not really, this is what it looks like, but this is what it is. And then painters and photographers went along with expeditionary forces as they settle out into the West. And this is by Albert Bierstadt in the second half of the century. It's Landers Peak in the Rockies. Now there's again a Native American encampment down in the front. To give you a sense of the scale, the magnificence of this country and its landscape, and mountains that were not even like the Alps because they rose, the Rockies just rose from flat land, and then there are the mountains. So it's a landscape that's not familiar to anyone in Europe. And it shouldn't because Landers Peak didn't exist. It's been added, making this an even grander scene. But Bierstadt would, when not so much accused, but asked about the paintings, because people have never been there. Is this truly what it looks like? Yes, we should go there. We must have that land. He would say, everything I show is real. It's just perhaps not in that arrangement. And photographers, look, this is a paean to progress because that's railroad tracks. It's on the Columbia River here, and this was done in 1860, well, late 1860s. But look how the photographer has settled it. So those tracks you just lead into the distance, right? It's that still we're going to Landers Peak. Now we're going on, always moving. This country is always moving. This is from the 1830s, 1930s of the Grand Canyon. Painters now were often hired by railroads, by hotel chains to create these marvelous scenes to encourage people to go. And this is the same location, and here's the change. Look at this. No horizon. No sky. No way to orient yourself at all. It's just a painting painted from the top to the bottom. You don't have that sense so much of something that's sort of a topography that you can understand. Something else is coming in now, and it's not that so much a change in this country. This is by the same artist. It's Arthur Wesley Dow. And this is a little tiny woodcut. It's Japanese art. Like one of Hokusai's views of Mount Fuji. So, and this is that as I say, mark into the 20th century. It's no longer so much landscape as a, at least it's no longer so obviously landscape as a religious exaltation of this country, or a patriotic one, or even a sentimental one. Now, in the 20th century more, it's like landscape is a subject used by the artist to work out things in painting and in his own psyche. It's much more personalized. So now this is where I'm starting. I'm going to show you a couple of paintings that I don't think I'd ever pay any attention to myself. And looking at them, they're nice. This is by an artist named Theodore Robinson. And he was a very good friend of Monet. So the first McCall sort of modern movement in landscape painting in this country came in the 1880s, but it was the American Impressionism. And American Impressionism still continues. I Googled, there's a Chicago Impressionist group. The Pennsylvania Impressionism School is quite significant, and that's centered in Bucks County and around New Hope. And then there's the West Coast Impressionists. So it has survived for a very long time. And he was one of the first artists to come back into this country from his, I think for about 10 years, summer forays, going to France, and bringing it back with him. Now, American Impressionism doesn't look exactly like Monet or Renoir, certainly, or Sisley, but that idea of just quick brushwork and subject matter that is just inconsequential, life is the way we see it, is new. And this one, I started with this particular one. I don't have very many of him to bring in here. First, he died young, among other things. That shows a little bit that Japanese, it's sort of flat. Like it's not like, oh, going into a distant horizon. It sort of goes up the picture. It doesn't go back in your illusion. This one, he did a Giverny. I mean, he lived just essentially the equivalent of down the street from Monet. And they were very good friends, but he never exactly copies Monet's style. His, it's hard to tell from these examples, but the word is about American Impressionists. Generally, they keep a sense of structure. It's not just color of forms and not such good drawing. The Americans like things solid. And there's some of that in his. See, this is a French work. But the subject matter, well, of course, this. And then after those summers he spent in France, he decided he's going to, from then on, unfortunately, for not very long, concentrate on American subjects. One reason we don't see many of these paintings is because he died when he was young middle-aged from an asthma attack, but also because the Metropolitan Museum and other museums would not accept his work. It's just not worthy because Impressionism was still not widely accepted in this country. He was one of the men who was first crusading for it, teaching students in Pennsylvania, in New York City, trying to persuade them to come into the 20th century, come into the late 19th century, come into a new way of looking at the world. Because this is a view in New York State. Here's a Hudson River artist painting of that same area. You know, this wonderful golden glow, mountain wilderness, the magnificence of this country. This is a canal. This is a canal that was created so that they could bring coal from Pennsylvania to New York. And there are the mountains in the background. So it's now just showing life as it is right now. There's no longer an ennobled meaning in this. There are no suggestions. This is just life. And that's worthwhile doing in a painting. That's quite new. This is a French one. You see he's doing something, looks quite French. And another one. Just a quotidian life. Just somewhat weathered buildings. There's no glorification of what's modern in the world, and you don't see those boats loaded with coal plying up and down the canal. But You could go there and see this scene. So the only impressionists who I brought out truly from this, and only in a few paintings, is child. He liked his name pronounced either way, Hassam or Hassam. And he had a nice long life. He did, I Googled this to be sure that I got this right, about 2,000 paintings, watercolors, and prints in his lifetime. And he made a very substantial income from his art. He looks like a very clubbable man, doesn't he, there? Very assured. As he was. Now, this is an early painting he did, and this is a little like the group just before Impressionists called the Barbizon painters, the first French artists who were going out mainly into the Fontainebleau forest, but just showing the landscape. It has a kind of darkness and tone, and that's not the illustration, but it is. There's an underlaying color, not just white canvas. So there's a dark tonality to this. So he's sort of doing like mid-century French painting, about a generation later than the French were doing it. But he made a number of trips. Well, he spent 3 years in France, and he was converted to Impressionism, which was by then not new, but not widely accepted. And he helped to introduce it in this country. Now, other ones, you know, the name Prendergast and Twachtman, they're from this same time, but they concentrated more on the scenes of city life and the new suburban environment, whereas Hassam will do more country scenes. He started out doing city life. This is one he did in Boston with that flecking brushstroke, and he wants to show the change in light on a snowy day. And then he's quite famous for a series he did of flags. For this, you should have the full title. The 4th of July, 1916, the greatest display of the American flag ever seen in New York, climax of the Preparedness Day parade in May. It's World War I. Now we're going to come back and look at some of what Hartley did in relationship to World War I. So just keep that date in mind. It's a really lovely painting. Navesink. This is around 1908 or 1909, he painted it. And then he was invited by a woman called Celia Thaxter, who was sort of like a socialite, celebrity author in the late 19th century. And now I'm talking to people who know things now that I don't know. I can say the words, but I don't know this for myself. She settled by a new resort hotel on Appledore Island in the Isles of Shoals. Now, I know that's off Portsmouth, New Hampshire, but who knows that? Few people, right? And she was a great gardener, and she wrote about this land. And she invited Child Hassan and his wife to come up every summer, and he would sit on her veranda and paint, or go around the island and paint. And this is one of the views he did there. Now you see that also looks quite a bit like, this is a Monet. He has that light emanating out of the canvas. So, just, if this were still one of the really cold days being in here, I'm sure we get extra delight out of looking at this, but it's very pleasant. You can practically smell those flowers and feel the breezes, can't you? Hear the leaves rustling. Here's something, do I have that? I had something that Celia Thaxter wrote about it, because her writing has that same quality, just very sensuous, just enjoying the good things in life. Just how beautiful they are, these grassy, rocky slopes shelving gradually to the sea, where here and there a mass of tall, blossoming grass, softly swaying in the warm wind against a peaceful water. This is marvelously escapist. It's marvelously upper class. This is not showing the realities of life. And this is, of course, one thing that made him very wealthy, because it was paintings that are so pleasing. And they don't challenge us. They are just lovely. This is another view from Appledore Island. He's a very proficient painter. His friends were, of course, awed by the rate at which he could turn them out, and someone would say they wished he turned out a few fewer. But he just had such a dexterity, and it just poured out of him. But until his death, he always painted in this style. He never changed. The markets came, the markets went, but he had enough dealers that they would always say, this is selling, go on doing it. That's a really nice watercolor. He just took no time. This is a little tiny one. It's at Newburgh, just going up the Hudson, just like about this big. So he would have had just a little hard piece of cardboard, took it out, took his brush, just did a few. So that's just a part of the way that I'm making a big point of this, because it's going to be so very different from Hartley. But he just endlessly offered this forth. So when Impressionism became popular, and he was so good at this, he had so many dealers. He showed in every show. He entered every competition. I mean, he had a very good businessman sense of what to do. And he hated modern art. He absolutely hated it. And this is in the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. Now, Mr. Phillips collected new art. You know, Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party, that's in the Phillips collection. I mean, just great taste. And he had collected many Hassams. But then as the styles changed, he got rid of some. Two men never spoke again. Not because he deaccessioned those, but because he was buying modern things. I mean, this man was implacable in his resistance to it. Okay, now, not an artist, but oh my goodness, important in the world of the development of modern art in this country. That's his portrait made by Edward Steichen, just about the time that I'm going to talk about this. So Albert Stieglitz was, he sort of happened into photography, very circuitous way. I mean, he was studying chemistry, and he was working for a professor who was dealing with the chemicals for photography, and then he got interested in photography. And his main crusades, two in his life, one is to make photography be treated as a fine art, that it's not just a document, but it's an art form. And the other is that he what backed the idea of a modern American art. Nothing tied to Europe, but a truly American, something that has as much the essence of this country as they thought the landscapes had in the 19th century. I thought I should have brought the more familiar photograph, the people disembarking from the ship, the 2-level, that's by him, and then this flat iron. And also, you'll see him again because you hear about him again since he was the husband of Georgia O'Keeffe. But at this time, I don't remember what it started around, maybe 1905 or so, up in this circle apartment up here, which was across the hall from where Edward Steichen lived. When that apartment became empty, Steichen said to Stieglitz, let's start a gallery there. And they started a gallery called, now casually, the 291, because it's at 291 Fifth Avenue, on the lower Fifth Avenue. And it was called the New Gallery of the Photo Secession. And it was to be primarily, a lot involved with photographs, but also the newest art from Europe, and then also what Stieglitz saw in this country. And this is what the gallery looked like. What a shock that would have been for anybody who grew up in Hassan territory to look at this. The walls are covered in burlap. And the works are that sparingly hung. And the central work there, I think you could probably recognize. That's Picasso. He introduced Matisse and Picasso to this country, and Kandinsky. So actually, our idea of what modern art is in the beginning is partly by what he chose and what he advocated for. See, this is the closest I could get to an illustration of what a conventional gallery looked like at the time. So when you walked in there, you were definitely in another century, in another world. I'll tell you, he will see Hartley's work and then give Hartley 2 shows. But what else he brought in that's now we consider important is photography, and also he brought in he had a show of African art and pre-Columbian art and children's art. So he was just opening up the whole realm of what can be considered not just polite and beautiful, but all of this is art. So now we come to the man of the... Let me take just a quick... How many of you are familiar with his art? Marsden Hartley? 1, 2, 3. There have been several shows in Manhattan in the last decade and a half, and there are many books on him. He's a complicated, elusive artist. This is Stieglitz's photograph of him. And you see Stieglitz is even presenting him as someone other than the ordinary. Now, I will leave that on while I tell you a little about his life, early life anyway. He was born in Lewiston, Maine, and must have been terrible. I think he had 8 older sisters. Can you imagine? Then when he came along, that must be, don't have to have any more kids. And his mother died when he was 8. His sisters moved to stay with relatives in Ohio. So he stayed behind with his dad. I think they moved to Boston by then. And for 1 year, he worked in a shoe factory. Then his father remarried, and the woman he married, her last name was Marsden. So that's where we get, he's Edmund Marsden, Hartley. Then he soon goes to Ohio with his sisters. Now, this part I don't know exactly, but he took lessons at the Cleveland Art Institute, and he clearly had some terrific gift or facility because he was given by private patrons scholarships to spend 4 years studying art in Manhattan. And then he went back up in the summers to paint. And that's where we'll start looking at some of his work. Well, let me just prepare you a little bit more, because I'm going to focus primarily on landscapes, but I'm going to have a segment now to give you something of the scope of what he did. He was more like Picasso in that he does this in this style, and then this in this style. He does totally abstract works. He does abstracted works. He does realistic works. He does romantic works. He does mechanically looking works. He does still life, landscape, abstract works, and then only toward the end of his life does he do figural scenes. He lives in New York, Boston, Bermuda, Mexico, New Mexico, Germany, Paris. I think he spent some time in Italy. He could never stay any place for very long. And then the most personal thing that, of course, is like, I feel wrong saying this, but this certainly affects all his doing, that he was homosexual at a time when this country was just vile about any sexuality that's deviant from the norm. And he suffered from that terribly. I'll give you an example of that later on. So this is an early painting he did. Oh, Impressionist. This is just nice. I mean, that could be a Van Gogh, because it has kind of the thicker paint like Van Gogh. After all, I'm going to have to look at these sometimes. Sure, I'll give you that. Because he didn't put titles on things. So it's painting number 1, painting number 2, and that's just someone else has done it for him. So this is 1907. And now I'm going to skip. We'll come back to some that I'm skipping, but I want to show you the degree of change. And also, this is the painting, I think if anyone is familiar with him, this is probably one of the works they're likely to know. It's in the Met. And the man is standing there to give you an idea of the scale of the painting. It's called The Portrait of a German Officer. In 1912, Stieglitz and several other men who wanted to foster his career gave him enough money so that he could go to Paris. And in Paris, they also provided an introduction to Gertrude Stein. That's Gertrude Stein's apartment. In Gertrude Stein's apartment, he saw the works of Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso. He met Matisse, Picasso. And you can see in there, well, let me do a little. Of course, there's Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is just on the cusp of his moving into Cubism, but where forms sort of slide in and out of one another. See how things get kind of broken? You have to look at bits. Like there's a wavy black and white flag, it disappears, and it comes out the other side. Is it behind, or is it just on one side? Just, things get fragmented. But those early, oh, I'm going wrong here. The early Picassos, this is just pre-Cubism. They're not very colorful. The French artists were the new, really radical artists are much more interested in sort of the analyzing form and structure. It's really quite intellectual. So he stayed there, and then he went to Germany, and he loved Berlin. And in Berlin, he met Kandinsky and Franz Bruch. He exhibited with Kandinsky. This is a painting by Kandinsky. What is this? This is color. This is emotion. This is an emotional landscape. You see the way it's painted, the vividness of the color. Which is where he wanted to stay. And then it's not known exactly extent to which this is going to affect his career, but he definitely had a love interest there. There's discussion, is it reciprocated or not? A man named Karl von Freiburg, who at the outbreak of World War I was killed when his horse was shot out from under him in the third month of the war, which just devastated him. I mean, Hartley was devastated. And this painting is full of references to that. So Freiburg was in the cavalry, and the lower right corner, you see that spur. And he was, shortly before he died, he was given the Iron Cross. And I think he was in the 4th Regiment, and there's a 4. And his initials, KVF, are down on the lower right. Now, that is someone who is so thoroughly sublimated, so concealing. He doesn't show you the man. He tells you all about the man. He doesn't let you know what he's feeling about the man. There's nothing expressive. It's all in there. I'm remembering this about him. I'm remembering this about him. I'm remembering this about him. He did this while he was in Berlin, too. It's called Indian Artifacts. He's one of the first people who looked at Native American art and said, this is art. But see how now the surfaces are all smooth, and it's so perfectly geometrical and so controlled and so planned. Can you tell me what this is? I'll tell you in a minute. Keep this out in front of me. Flower abstraction. Well, of course you can see that's a flower. Up here she said, angry school teacher. But those would be the leaves, I suppose, the round flower. A still life with pears. This is done after the abstraction. And done by one of his great heroes is Cézanne. I couldn't find a good illustration of Cézanne. Cézanne does do paintings of pears with a cloth to one side, but this is as close as I could get for that. And he does this near the end of his life. This looks like a wonderful, quite three-dimensional, as if you could touch the surface of those flowers there and that crumpled cloth. This he painted because there was another tragedy. Later in his life, he was living in Nova Scotia with a fisher family, the young men in the family were fishermen, and two of them drowned in a storm. And in Nova Scotia, there was annually a service for people who died in the sea. And one of the parts of the service is that they threw roses out into the water. So this again has grief, memory under it, which you would never know. This is one of the boys who died. The reference to that would be the flower. Another. Now, these paintings to me are so astonishing because there's something he said that he sought, which I in this feel that he got. He wants things to be more real than real. Don't you have such a strong sense of a person there almost coming out at you, the force of the personality in that existence? Or you can look at it as a very stylized figure. How can it be both? To me, it is. Lobster fisherman. Now, this looks so childish. And this is later yet. But this is a time when he's exploring that children's art where there's a deliberate desire to be awkward and naive. Now, this is all the same artists who from now on we're going to look at just for landscapes. Oh, well, this is not that artist first. This is Albert Pinkham Ryder, who had a career right at the turn of the century. Great eccentric paintings. He showed them in New York. They tend to be small, and he put layer on layer on layer on paint on it, and it's probably wax too. You can hardly make out what they are. So this is just, there's a lane, and you can see the cows there, and how thickly painted this is, how crude it looks.
Maggie,
Mhm.
the houses or something stretched out on the side.
This scratching most of here is because he also put wax on it, and so that's just that's a deterioration as it dries. He did marine scenes a lot, so you can see a few sailboats there. Later on, Hartley, who is not only a painter but also a poet and art critic, he wrote a history of what American painting would be, American landscape painting. This is where he said it started. Now Thomas Cole in Catterskill Falls. He never mentions Catterskill, never mentions Cole. This is his idea of the beginning. And this is what Marsden Hartley does with it. So he came back up to Lewiston and was sort of living with family. And then in the summers, he would go off to paint and sketch. One summer he went to a retreat for a spiritual retreat, but other than that, he just painted. He took almost no money. He lived in isolation and painted. And these are the paintings he was doing. Now, he hasn't been to Germany yet, but this is a man who's not doing anything that anyone else was doing other than what he saw maybe Ryder was doing. This is not what 19th century American artists were doing. So here's the modern part of this. So much of modern painting, whatever the subject is, you don't consider all 20th century modern, but this chunk is called modern. The subject represented is simply the way for the artist to explore and express his own subjective reaction to it. There's a far more personalized quality to it. And here, he was in the depths of despair. at this. This. These are what Stieglitz saw and said, I'll give you a show. And introduced him to the world of, because he saw this is just so original. This is someone who's not doing what anyone else is doing. And Stieglitz with this like, I've got to find an American art, a truly American art. Not like Hassam, shaped by Europe, American, a modern American art. And Stieglitz will sort of foster Hartley's career. Yeah, many places you go, you say this is a gift from the Stieglitz collection. But they did finally in 1937, had a rift because Stieglitz just gave up, said, you're never going to produce something that's truly American. And so this is still in the first decade of the 20th century. Hartley said, oh, he wrote about how he's just stuck in doing things that are so dark. And he just expressed his spirit is feeling down. He had lots of suicidal episodes. It's his spirit who feels that way. He couldn't work his way out of that. And then he started doing sort of the mountains between New Hampshire and Maine. He went up there, and he especially liked fall scenes. And he started doing ones like this. Where did he get the idea of color? He saw in a magazine a color reproduction of a painting by an artist we now think kind of obscure, but a late 19th century artist named Segantini. And this is a detail from his work. And it was the brushwork. It's lots of little strokes, one right next to another. Here's a detail of another painting. So from seeing that illustration, there's another way I can do it. I can start doing those stitch strokes, and I can use color. So I want to see what else is 20th century about this. I mean, this is a real location. Does that look like a real landscape? Am I telling you how you ought to think about that? How would you get to that mountain? How high is that mountain? Do you know mountains who at their top edge have a nice crisp outline? That mountain just goes to the top of the canvas, doesn't it? It doesn't go, it's not back there somewhere. This is all like just a really two-dimensional painting where you look at it, say, oh yes, it's a landscape, and you can see the colors of fall, but you can also see each separate stroke. And you can see, how about clouds that have outlines? You can see how it's drawn. It's no longer seeking to be just an illusion of the world that were you to go there, you would see. This is a painting. And I want to say, this is George Innes. There's something else about this that's really giving you so much content. I had trepidations about doing something on truly modern art because I don't know, even now, modern art's not always easy to comprehend. When he was suffering up there in those dark woods, he was reading Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Emerson's essays about how a person can find himself or herself in nature, and that you can also find the essence of nature, which is something not visible, but there's a spiritual essence in the natural world. Well, that's a very common view for people. I'm thinking, like, how many people say, I'm not religious anymore, but I'm spiritual and I get it out in nature. I mean, it's just part of it, accepted in our culture. But this was quite new. And he was wanting to express that this is what I'm getting out of the natural world. This is not what the world looks like. And that's a little bit different from Innes, because Innes he was expressing something about nature, that nature was always changing, just as he was always changing. It's a spiritual message, but a different one from. Let's just give you a couple of these. So it comes back to it again and again. Another source for him. Both the strokes and the clouds, look how much like that. So he's looking at nature. He's looking inside. He's looking at reproductions, because he hasn't been to Europe yet. He's seeing what Segantini is doing. He's seeing what Van Gogh is doing. He's pulling that all in. This is a different painting. Look how he's got such a sense of symmetry. If you've got that mountain in the beginning, you're going to have a cloud on one side, you're going to have a cloud on the other. So he's doing this again and again, working out whatever he needs to work out. So they gave him money, and then he takes that trip to Germany. And this is another one he did there, just you should see. So he has done those ones, and then this is what he's doing next. It's just called Warriors. He loved what now we would call performative masculinity. He loved the military parades in Berlin. He loved the color. Evidently, the actual martial aspect of it, nothing. Oh, this is the one that I forgot. See, my time is up, and I'm somehow managed to avoid to remember what I was going to tell you about these paintings. Or let's take this one. When Stieglitz showed this, there was a review. You can imagine the reviewers are quite hostile to it. But do you know what the reviewers call this? That his art is too dainty. Do you know what they're talking about?
Oh.
That's right. They're talking about his sexuality. I'm like, can you imagine that's how this painting, the critic is so eager to comment on his sexuality, they can't even look at the painting. Maybe what the critic is just saying, oh, this painting makes me really uncomfortable. But to present it like that is like. So this is an artist who's a difficult man who had a difficult life, and he faced a very difficult situation. And he loved Berlin. But look, do you see there how that center against symmetrical pattern and that one with the TP before? That's the same thing he did with the mountain, isn't it? This is some Ur pattern in him. Only now he makes this very symmetrical. It sort of looks like an icon almost, like angels all around the seated, enthroned deity. And this is the point at which we leave. And if you come back next week, come refreshed, because we're going to take some time with some watercolors. When he came back, he was invited by another woman who's a great patron of the arts named Mabel Dodge to come out to New Mexico. And he goes about a decade before Georgia O'Keeffe comes. So I'll show you next time his works in New Mexico. And that's to the moment, the hour. Do you have questions or remarks, or you go home and wince thinking about those dainty paintings too? So, yeah.
The purplish one.
Yes. But he did that before he'd been there. He did that before he'd been there. He saw, this is like, he was seeing illustrations. He was grabbing it from any source. So, yeah. And you know, color illustrations then were pretty rotten, but you can get an idea of what was going on. Any other? Well, go enjoy the week, please. Yeah, bye.